Hi, scholars. Today we're starting the novel Number the Stars, written by Lois Lowry. This novel was written in 1989. It won the Newbery Medal in 1990 for Best Children's Literature. So please get comfy, get cozy, get ready to listen. I am going to be reading 3 chapters to you today. Let's get started. Chapter 1. Why are you running? I'll race you to the corner, Ellen. Anne-Marie adjusted the thick leather pack on her back so that her school books balanced evenly. Ready? She looked at her best friend. Ellen made a face. No, she said, laughing. You know I can't beat you. My legs aren't as long. Can't we just walk like civilized people? She was a stocky 10-year-old, unlike lanky Anne-Marie. We have to practice for the athletic meet on Friday. I know I'm going to win the girls' race this week. I was second last week, but I've been practicing every day. Come on, Ellen, Anne-Marie pleaded, eyeing the distance to the next corner of the Copenhagen street. Please. Ellen hesitated, then nodded and shifted her own rustic of books against her shoulders. Oh, all right. Ready? She said. Go! Shouted Anne-Marie, and the 2 girls were off, racing along the residential sidewalk. Anne-Marie's silvery blonde hair flew behind her, and Ellen's dark pigtails bounced against her shoulders. Wait for me, wailed little Christy, left behind, but the 2 older girls weren't listening. Anne-Marie outdistanced her friend quickly, even though one of her shoes came untied as she sped along the street called Austenbrogade, past the small shops and cafes of her neighborhood here in northeast Copenhagen. Laughing, she skirted an elderly lady in black who carried a shopping bag made of string. A young woman pushing a baby in a carriage moved aside to make way. The corner was just ahead. Anne-Marie looked up, panting, just as she reached the corner. Her laughter stopped. Her heart seemed to skip a beat. Halt! The soldier ordered in a stern voice. The German word was as familiar as it was frightening. Anne-Marie had heard it often enough before, but it had never been directed at her until now. Behind her, Ellen also slowed and stopped. Far back, little Kirsty was plodding along, her face in a pout because the girls hadn't waited for her. Anne-Marie stared up. There were 2 of them. That meant 2 helmets, 2 sets of cold eyes glaring at her, and 4 tall, shiny boots planted firmly on the sidewalk, blocking her path to home. And it meant 2 rifles, gripped in the hands of the soldiers. She stared at the rifles first. Then, finally, she looked into the face of the soldier who had ordered her to halt. Why are you running? The harsh voice asked. His Danish was very poor. 3 years, Anne-Marie thought with contempt. 3 years they've been in our country and still they can't speak our language. I was racing with my friend, she answered politely. We have races at school every Friday and I want to do well, so I... Her voice trailed away, the sentence unfinished. Don't talk so much, she told herself. Just answer them, that's all. She glanced back. Ellen was motionless on the sidewalk a few yards behind her. Farther back, Kirsty was still sulking and walking slowly toward the corner. Nearby, a woman had come to the doorway of a shop and was standing silently, watching. One of the soldiers, the taller one, moved toward her. Anne-Marie recognized him as the one she and Ellen always called in whispers, the giraffe, because of his height and the long neck that extended from his stiff collar. He and his partner were always on this corner. He prodded the corner of her backpack with the stock of his rifle. Anne-Marie trembled. What is in here? He asked loudly. From the corner of her eye, she saw the shopkeeper move quietly back into the shadows of the doorway, out of sight. School books, she answered truthfully. Are you a good student? The soldier asked. He seemed to be sneering. Yes. What is your name? Anne-Marie Johansson. Your friend, is she a good student too? He was looking beyond her at Ellen, who hadn't moved. Anne-Marie looked back too and saw that Ellen's face, usually rosy-cheeked, was pale and her dark eyes were wide. She nodded at the soldier. Better than me, she said. What is her name? Ellen. And who is this? He asked, looking to Anne-Marie's side. Kirsty had appeared there suddenly, scowling at everyone. My little sister. She reached down for Kirsty's hand, but Kirsty, always stubborn, refused it and put her hands on her hips defiantly. The soldier reached down and stroked her little sister's short, tangled curls. Stand still, Kirsty, Anne-Marie ordered silently, praying that somehow the obstinate 5-year-old would receive the message. But Kirsty reached up and pushed the soldier's hand away. Don't, she said loudly. Both soldiers began to laugh. They spoke to each other in rapid German that Anne-Marie couldn't understand. She is pretty, like my own little girl, the tall one said in a more pleasant voice. Anne-Marie tried to smile politely. Go home, all of you. Go study your school books, and don't run. You look like hoodlums when you run. The two soldiers turned away. Quickly, Anne-Marie reached down again and grabbed her sister's hand before Kirsty could resist. Hurrying the little girl along, she rounded the corner. In a moment, Ellen was beside her. They walked quickly, not speaking, with Kirsty between them, toward the large apartment building where both families lived. When they were almost home, Ellen whispered suddenly, I was so scared. Me too, Anne-Marie whispered back. As they turned to enter their building, both girls looked straight ahead toward the door. They did it purposely so that they would not catch the eyes or the attention of two more soldiers who stood with their guns on this corner as well. Kirsty scurried ahead of them through the door, chattering about the picture she was bringing home from kindergarten to show Mama. For Kirsty, the soldiers were simply part of the landscape, something that had always been there on every corner, as unimportant as lampposts throughout her remembered life. Are you going to tell your mother? Ellen asked Anne-Marie as they trudged together up the stairs. I'm not. My mother would be upset. No, I won't either. Mama would probably scold me for running on the street. She said goodbye to Ellen on the second floor where Ellen lived and continued on to the third, practicing in her mind a cheerful greeting for her mother, a smile, a description of today's spelling test in which she had done well. But she was too late. Kirsty had gotten there first. And he poked Anne-Marie's book bag with his gun, and then he grabbed my hair. Kirsty was chattering as she took off her sweater in the center of the apartment living room. But I wasn't scared. Anne-Marie was, and Ellen too, but not me. Mrs. Johansson rose quickly from the chair by the window where she'd been sitting. Mrs. Rosen, Ellen's mother, was there too, in the opposite chair. They'd been having coffee together, as they did many afternoons. Of course it wasn't really coffee, though the mothers still called it that. Having coffee. There had been no real coffee in Copenhagen since the beginning of the Nazi occupation, not even any real tea. The mothers sipped at hot water flavored with herbs. Anne-Marie, what happened? What is Kirsty talking about? Her mother asked anxiously. Where's Ellen? Mrs. Rosen had a frightened look. Ellen's in your apartment. She didn't realize you were here, Anne-Marie explained. Don't worry, it wasn't anything. It was the two soldiers who stand in the corner of Austin Brigade. You've seen them. You know, the tall one with the long neck, the one who looks like a silly giraffe. She told her mother and Mrs. Rosen of the incident, trying to make it sound humorous and unimportant, but their uneasy looks didn't change. I slapped his hand and shouted at him, Kirsty announced, importantly. No, she didn't, Mama, Anne-Marie reassured her mother. She's exaggerating, as she always does. Mrs. Johansson moved to the window and looked down to the street below. The Copenhagen neighborhood was quiet. It looked the same as always, people coming and going from the shops, children at play, the soldiers on the corner. She spoke in a low voice to Ellen's mother. They must be edgy because of the latest resistance incidents. Did you read in Dr. Ferdonsk about the bombings in Hilderad and Nuremberg? Although she pretended to be absorbed in unpacking her schoolbooks, Anne-Marie listened, and she knew what her mother was referring to. Dr. Freydansk, the Free Danes, was an illegal newspaper. Peter Nielsen brought it to them occasionally, carefully folded and hidden among ordinary books and papers, and Mama always burned it after she and Papa had read it. But Anne-Marie heard Mama and Papa talk, sometimes at night, about the news they received that way. News of sabotage against the Nazis, bombs hidden and exploded in the factories that produced war materials, an industrial railroad line damaged so that the goods couldn't be transported. And she knew what resistance meant. Papa had explained when she overheard the word and asked. The resistance fighters were Danish people. No one knew who, because they were very secret. Who were determined to bring harm to the Nazis however they could. They damaged the German trucks and cars and bombed their factories. They were very brave. Sometimes they were caught and killed. I must go and speak to Ellen, Mrs. Rosen said, moving toward the door. You girls walk a different way to school tomorrow. Promise me, Anne-Marie, and Ellen will promise too. We will, Mrs. Rosen, but what does it matter? There are German soldiers on every corner. They will remember your faces, Mrs. Rosen said, turning in the doorway to the hall. It is important to be one of the crowd. Always. Be one of many. Be sure that they never have reason to remember your face. She disappeared into the hall and closed the door behind her. He'll remember my face, Mama, Kirsty announced happily, because he said I look like his little girl. He said I was pretty. If he has such a pretty little girl, why doesn't he go back to her like a good father? Mrs. Johansson murmured, stroking Kirsty's cheek. Why doesn't he go back to his own country? Mama, is there anything to eat? Anne-Marie asked, hoping to take her mother's mind away from the soldiers. Take some bread and give a piece to your sister. With butter? Kirsty asked hopefully. No butter, her mother replied. You know that. Kirsty sighed as Anne-Marie went to the bread box in the kitchen. I wish I could have a cupcake, she said. A big yellow cupcake with pink frosting. Her mother laughed. For a little girl, you have a very long memory, she told Kirsty. There hasn't been any butter or sugar for cupcakes for a very long time. A year at least. When will there be cupcakes again? When the war ends, Mrs. Johansson said. She glanced through the window down to the street corner where the soldiers stood, their faces impassive beneath the metal helmets. When the soldiers leave. Chapter 2. Who is the man who rides past? Tell me a story, Anne-Marie, begged Kirsty as she snuggled beside her sister in the big bed they shared. Tell me a fairy tale. Anne-Marie smiled and wrapped her arms around her little sister in the dark. All Danish children grew up with familiar fairy tales. Hans Christian Andersen, the most famous of the tale tellers, had been Danish himself. Do you want the one about the little mermaid? That one had always been Anne-Marie's own favorite. But Kirsty said no. Tell me one that starts with a king and a queen, and they have a beautiful daughter. All right. Once upon a time, there was a king, Anne-Marie began. And a queen, whispered Kirsty. Don't forget the queen. And a queen. They lived together in a wonderful palace, and was the palace named Amlenborg? Kirsty asked sleepily. Shh, don't keep interrupting or I'll never finish. The story. No, it wasn't Amlenborg. It was a pretend place. Anne-Marie talked on, making up a story of a king and queen and their beautiful daughter, Princess Kirsten. She sprinkled her tale with formal balls, fabulous gold-trimmed gowns, and feasts of pink frosted cupcakes, until Kirsty's deep, even breathing told her that her sister was sound asleep. She stopped, waited for a moment, half expecting Kirsty to murmur, Then what happened? But Kirsty was still. Anne-Marie's thoughts turned to the real king, Christian X, and the real palace, Amlenborg, where he lived in the center of Copenhagen. How the people of Denmark loved King Christian. He was not like fairy tale kings, who seemed to stand on balconies giving orders to subjects, or who sat on golden thrones demanding to be entertained and looking for suitable husbands for their daughters. King Christian was a real human being, a man with a serious, kind face. She had seen him often when she was younger. Each morning he had come from the palace on his horse Jubilee and ridden along through the streets of Copenhagen, greeting his people. Sometimes when Anne-Marie was a little girl, her older sister Eliza had taken her to stand on the sidewalk so that she could wave to King Christian. Sometimes he had waved back to the two of them and smiled. "Now you are special forever," Liza had told her once, "because you have been greeted by a king." Anne-Marie turned her head on the pillow and stared through the partly open curtains of the window into the dim September night. Thinking of Liza, her solemn, lovely sister, always made her sad. So she turned her thoughts again to the king, who was still alive, as Liza was not. She remembered a story that Papa had told her shortly after the war began, shortly after Denmark had surrendered and the soldiers had moved in overnight to take their places on the corners. One evening, Papa had told her that earlier he was on an errand near his office, standing on the corner waiting to cross the street, when King Christian came by on his morning ride. One of the German soldiers had turned suddenly and asked a question of a teenage boy nearby. "Who is that man who rides past here every morning on his horse?" the German soldier had asked. Papa said he had smiled to himself, amused that the German soldier did not know. He listened while the boy answered. "He is our king," the boy told the soldier. "He is the king of Denmark." "Where is his bodyguard?" the soldier had asked. And do you know what that boy said? Papa had asked Anne-Marie. She was sitting on his lap. She was little then, only 7 years old. She shook her head, waiting to hear the answer. The boy looked right at the soldier and he said, "All of Denmark is his bodyguard." Anne-Marie had shivered. It sounded like a very brave answer. "Is it true, Papa?" she asked, "what the boy said?" Papa thought for a moment. He always considered questions very carefully before he answered them. "Yes," he said at last, "it's true. Any Danish citizen would die for King Christian to protect him." "You too, Papa?" "Yes." "And Mama?" "Mama too." Anne-Marie shivered again. "Then I would too, Papa, if I had to." They sat silently for a moment. From across the room, Mama watched them, Anne-Marie and Papa, and she smiled. Mama had been crocheting that evening 3 years ago. The lacy edging of a pillowcase, part of Liza's trousseau. Her fingers moved rapidly, turning thin white thread into an intricate narrow border. Liza was a grown-up girl of 18 then, about to be married to Peter Nelson. When Liza and Peter married, Mama said, Anne-Marie and Kirsty would have a brother for the very first time. "Papa," Anne-Marie had said finally into the silence, "sometimes I wonder why the king wasn't able to protect us. Why didn't he fight the Nazis so that they wouldn't come into Denmark with their guns?" Papa sighed. "We are such a tiny country," he said, "and they are such an enormous enemy. Our king was wise. He knew how few soldiers Denmark had. He knew that many, many Danish people would die if we fought." "In Norway they fought," Anne-Marie pointed out. Papa nodded. "They fought very fiercely in Norway. They had those huge mountains for the Norwegian soldiers to hide in. Even so, Norway was crushed." In her mind, Anne-Marie had pictured Norway as she remembered it from the map at school, up above Denmark. Norway was pink on the school map. She imagined the pink strip of Norway crushed by a fist. "Are there German soldiers in Norway now, the same as here?" "Yes," said Papa. "In Holland too," Mama added from across the room, "and Belgium and France." "But not in Sweden," Anne-Marie announced, proud that she knew so much about the world. Sweden was blue on the map, and she had seen Sweden, even though she had never been there. Standing behind Uncle Henrik's house, north of Copenhagen, she had looked across the water, the part of the North Sea that was called the Kattegat, to the land on the other side. "That is Sweden you are seeing," Uncle Henrik had told her. "You are looking across to another country." "That's true," Papa had said. "Sweden is still free." And now, 3 years later, it was still true, but much else had changed. King Christian was getting old, and he had been badly injured last year in a fall from his horse, faithful old Jubilee, who had carried him around Copenhagen so many mornings. For days they thought he would die, and all of Denmark had mourned. But he hadn't. King Christian X was still alive. It was Liza who was not. It was her tall, beautiful sister who had died in an accident 2 weeks before her wedding. In the blue carved trunk in the corner of this bedroom, Anne-Marie could still see its shape even in the dark, were folded Liza's pillowcases with their crocheted edges, her wedding dress with its hand-embroidered neckline unworn, and the yellow dress that she had worn and danced in, with its full skirt flying at the party celebrating her engagement to Peter. Mama and Papa never spoke of Liza. They never opened the trunk, but Anne-Marie did from time to time when she was alone in the apartment. Alone, she touched Liza's things gently, remembering her quiet, soft-spoken sister who had looked forward so to marriage and children of her own. Red-headed Peter, her sister's fiancé, had not married anyone in the years since Liza's death. He had changed a great deal. Once, he had been like a fun-loving older brother to Anne-Marie and Kirsty, teasing and tickling, always a source of foolishness and pranks. Now, he still stopped by the apartment often, and his greetings to the girls were warm and smiling, but he was usually in a hurry, talking quickly to Mama and Papa about things Anne-Marie didn't understand. He no longer sang the nonsense songs that had once made Anne-Marie and Kirsty shriek with laughter, and he never lingered any more. Papa had changed too. He seemed much older and very tired, defeated. The whole world had changed. Only the fairy tales remained the same. And they lived happily ever after, Anne-Marie recited, whispering into the dark, completing the tale for her sister, who slept beside her, one thumb in her mouth. Chapter 3. Where is Mrs. Hirsch? The days of September passed, one after the other, much the same. Anne-Marie and Ellen walked to school together and home again, always now taking the longer way, avoiding the tall soldier and his partner. Kirsty dawdled just behind them, or scampered ahead, never out of their sight. The two mothers still had their coffee together in the afternoons. They began to knit mittens as the days grew slightly shorter and the first leaves began to fall from the trees, because another winter was coming. Everyone remembered the last one. There was no fuel now for the homes and apartments in Copenhagen, and the winter nights were terribly cold. Like the other families in their building, the Johansons had opened the old chimney and installed a little stove to use for heat when they could find coal to burn. Mama used it too, sometimes for cooking, because electricity was rationed now. At night, they used candles for light. Sometimes Ellen's father, a teacher, complained in frustration because he couldn't see in the dim light to correct his students' papers. "Soon we will have to add another blanket to your bed," Mama said one morning as she and Anne-Marie tidied the bedroom. "Kirsty and I are lucky to have each other for warmth in winter," Anne-Marie said. "Poor Ellen, to have no sisters." "She will have to snuggle in with her Mama and Papa when it gets cold," Mama said, smiling. "I remember when Kirsty slept between you and Papa. She was supposed to stay in her crib, but in the middle of the night she would climb out and get in with you," Anne-Marie said, smoothing the pillows on the bed. Then she hesitated and glanced at her mother, fearful that she had said the wrong thing, the thing that would bring the pained look to her mother's face. The days when little Kirsty slept in Mama and Papa's room were the days when Liza and Anne-Marie shared this bed. But Mama was laughing quietly. "I remember, too," she said. "Sometimes she wet the bed in the middle of the night." "I did not," Kirsty said haughtily from the bedroom door. "I never ever did that." Mama, still laughing, knelt and kissed Kirsty on the cheek. "Time to leave for school, girls," she said. She began to button Kirsty's jacket. "Oh, dear," she said suddenly. "Look, this button has broken right in half. Anne-Marie, take Kirsty with you after school to the little shop where Mrs. Hirsch sells thread and buttons. See if you can buy just one to match the others on her jacket. I'll give you some kroner. It shouldn't cost very much." But after school, when the girls stopped at the shop, which had been there as long as Anne-Marie could remember, they found it closed. There was a new padlock on the door and a sign, but the sign was in German. They couldn't read the words. I wonder if Mrs. Hirsch is sick, Anne-Marie said as they walked away. I saw her Saturday, Ellen said. She was with her husband and their son. They all looked just fine. Or at least the parents looked just fine. The son always looks like a horror, she giggled. Anne-Marie made a face. The Hirsch family lived in the neighborhood, so they had seen the boy, Samuel, often. He was a tall teenager with thick glasses, stooped shoulders, and unruly hair. He rode a bicycle to school, leaning forward and squinting, wrinkling his nose to nudge his glasses into place. His bicycle had wooden wheels, now that rubber tires weren't available, and it creaked and clattered on the street. I think the Hirsches all went on vacation to the seashore, Kirsty announced. And I suppose they took a big basket of pink frosted cupcakes with them, Anne-Marie said sarcastically to her sister. Yes, I suppose they did, Kirsty replied. Anne-Marie and Ellen exchanged looks that meant, Kirsty is so dumb. No one in Copenhagen had taken a vacation at the seashore since the war began. There were no pink frosted cupcakes. There hadn't been for months. Still, Anne-Marie thought, looking back at the shop before they turned the corner, where was Mrs. Hirsch? The Hirsch family had gone somewhere. Why else would they close the shop? Mama was troubled when she heard the news. Are you sure? She asked several times. We can find another button someplace, Anne-Marie reassured her. Or we could take one from the bottom of the jacket and move it up. It won't show very much. But it didn't seem to be the jacket that worried Mama. Are you sure the sign was in German? She asked. Maybe you didn't look carefully. Mama, it had a swastika on it. Her mother turned away with a distracted look. Anne-Marie, watch your sister for a few moments and began to peel the potatoes for dinner. I'll be right back. Where are you going? Anne-Marie asked as her mother started for the door. I want to talk to Mrs. Rosen. Puzzled, Anne-Marie watched her mother leave the apartment. She went to the kitchen and opened the door to the cupboard where the potatoes were kept. Every night now, it seemed, they had potatoes for dinner and very little else. Anne-Marie was almost asleep when there was a light knock on the bedroom door. Candlelight appeared at the door as the door opened and her mother stepped in. Are you asleep, Anne-Marie? No, why? Is something wrong? Nothing's wrong, but I'd like you to get up and come out to the living room. Pete is here. Papa and I want to talk to you. Anne-Marie jumped out of bed and Kirsty grunted in her sleep. Peter? She hadn't seen him in a long time. There was something frightening about his being here at night. Copenhagen had a curfew, and no citizens were allowed out after 8 o'clock. It was very dangerous, she knew, for Peter to visit at this time, but she was delighted that he was here. Though his visits were always hurried, they almost seemed secret somehow, in a way she couldn't quite put her finger on. Still, it was a treat to see Peter. It brought back memories of happier times, and her parents loved Peter too. They said he was like a son. Barefoot, she ran to the living room and into Peter's arms. He grinned, kissed her cheek, and ruffled her long hair. You've grown taller since I saw you last, he told her. You're all legs. Anne-Marie laughed. I won the girls' foot race last Friday at school, she told him proudly. Where have you been? We've missed you. My work takes me all over, Peter explained. Look, I brought you something, one for Kirsty too. He reached into his pocket and handed her 2 seashells. Anne-Marie put the smaller one on the table to save it for her sister. She held the other in her hands, turning it in the light, looking at the rigid, pearly surface. It was so like Peter to bring just the right gift. For your Mama and Papa, I brought something more practical, 2 bottles of beer. Mama and Papa smiled and raised their glasses. Papa took a sip and wiped the foam from his upper lip. Then his face became more serious. Anne-Marie, he said, Peter tells us that the Germans have issued orders closing many stores run by Jews. Jews? Anne-Marie repeated. Is Mrs. Hirsch Jewish? Is that why the button shop is closed? Why have they done that? Peter leaned forward. It is their way of tormenting. For some reason, they want to torment Jewish people. It has happened in the other countries. They have taken their time here, have let us relax a little, but now it seems to be starting. But why the button shop? What harm is a button shop? Mrs. Hirsch is such a nice lady. Even Samuel, he's a dope, but he would never harm anyone. How could he? He can't even see with his thick glasses. Then Anne-Marie thought of something else. If they can't sell their buttons, how will they earn a living? Friends will take care of them, Mama said gently. That's what friends do. Anne-Marie nodded. Mama was right, of course. Friends and neighbors would go to the home of the Hirsch family, would take them fish and potatoes and bread and herbs for making tea. Maybe Peter would even take them a beer. They would be comfortable until their shop was allowed to open again. Then, suddenly, she sat upright, her eyes wide. Mama, she said, Papa, the Rosens are Jewish too. Her parents nodded, their faces serious and drawn. I talked to Sophie Rosen this afternoon after you told me about the button shop, Mama said. She knows what is happening, but she doesn't think it will affect them. Anne-Marie thought and understood. She relaxed. Mr. Rosen doesn't have a shop. He's a teacher. They can't close a whole school. She looked at Peter with questions in her eyes. Can they? I think the Rosens will be all right, he said. But you keep an eye on your friend Ellen and stay away from the soldiers. Your mother told me about what happened on Austin Brigade. Anne-Marie shrugged. She had almost forgotten the incident. It was nothing. They were only bored and looking for someone to talk to, I think. She turned to her father. Papa, do you remember what you heard the boy say to the soldier, that all of Denmark would be the king's bodyguard? Her father smiled. I have never forgotten it, he said. Well, Anne-Marie said slowly, now I think that all of Denmark must be a bodyguard for the Jews as well. So we shall, Papa replied. Peter stood. I must go, he said. And you, Longlegs, it is way past your bedtime now. He hugged Anne-Marie again. Later, once more in bed, beside the warm cocoon of her sister, Anne-Marie remembered how her father had said 3 years before that he would die to protect the king, that his mother would too. And Anne-Marie, 7 years old, had announced proudly that she would also. Now she was 10, with long legs and no more silly dreams of pink frosted cupcakes. And now she and all of the Danes would to be bodyguard for Ellen and Ellen's parents and all of Denmark's Jews. Would she die to protect them? Truly? Anne-Marie was honest enough to admit, there in the darkness to herself, that she wasn't sure. For a moment she felt frightened, but she pulled the blanket up higher around her neck and relaxed. It was all imaginary anyway, not real. It was only in the fairy tales that people were called upon to be brave to die for one another, not in real-life Denmark. Oh, there were soldiers, that was true, and the courageous resistance leaders who sometimes lost their lives. That was true too. But ordinary people like the Rosens and the Johansons? Anne-Marie admitted to herself, snuggling there in the quiet dark, that she was glad to be an ordinary person who would never be called upon for courage. Okay guys, that's the first 3 chapters. So your job now is to go to the link in the description box underneath this video and click on the Padlet link for today and go ahead and answer those questions that I put in there for you. Remember, you need to hit the plus sign in the bottom right hand corner to bring up a new tab to start typing, and please don't forget to put your name. If you have any questions, remember you can text me, email me, or dojo me. Bye guys!